Welcome to this explainer. Today we're investigating a global default that, honestly, we all take for granted every single day. Think about it for a second. Every time you pour milk into your morning cereal, splash it into your coffee, melt cheese onto a pizza, or spread butter on some toast, you are almost certainly consuming cow's milk. It is so deeply embedded in our global food culture that it barely even registers as a choice anymore, right? It just registers as the absolute default. But how exactly did this happen?
So, let's dive right in and ask the central question of our whole investigation. There are more than 5,000 species of mammals on this planet, and by definition, every single one of them produces milk for their offspring. So out of thousands of milk-producing mammals, why did one specific bovine become the universal dairy animal? And, honestly, a more fun question, do humans actually drink the milk of other animals?
Let's get into Section 1, the biology of lactose. Because, as it turns out, milk is biologically calibrated for specific offspring. To really solve this mystery, we first have to fundamentally wrap our heads around the fact that milk isn't just one universal, uniform substance. It's an incredibly diverse biological liquid shaped entirely by evolution. Just take a look at the extreme 50% fat content of seal milk. While human and cow's milk have relatively similar, lower fat percentages, the seal's milk is literally in a league of its own. It perfectly illustrates how a mammal's milk is strictly biologically calibrated for its specific environment. Seal pups need to rapidly build up a thick layer of blubber to survive in freezing cold oceans, so their mother's milk delivers exactly that. It is essentially liquid blubber. Now, this intense biological calibration brings us to a massive hurdle in human history: lactose. Lactose is the specific sugar found in milk, and to actually digest it, your body needs an enzyme called lactase. All mammal infants produce it naturally, but typically, once they're weaned, the body just shuts down production because it's metabolically expensive. So for most of human history, adults couldn't actually digest the lactose in fresh milk without getting incredibly sick. That is, until a pretty miraculous genetic mutation popped up about 10,000 years ago called lactase persistence. This mutation kept that lactase gene switched on right into adulthood, completely changing the game for human nutrition. And the geographical divide of this mutation is absolutely fascinating. We see that populations of Northern European descent have a lactase persistence rate of 90% or higher, while populations of East Asian descent generally sit way below 20%. This genetic distribution maps almost perfectly onto the populations that historically kept dairy animals. It is literally coevolution happening in real time, humans and their dairy animals simultaneously shaping one another. But here is the really wild part. Early humans actually figured out how to process milk into cheese and yogurt way before they evolved the genetic ability to drink it fresh. When we trace the timeline back to early agriculturalists, they likely stored milk in animal stomach pouches, where natural rennet caused it to curdle into a soft cheese. This fermentation process naturally drains away or eats up the lactose. So dairying didn't start with a tall glass of cold milk. It started with fermented, processed dairy that anyone could digest. And that reliable food source is exactly what paved the way for the genetic mutation to thrive later on.
Moving right along to Section 2, a global milk menu. Let's explore the fascinating milks humans actually drink around the world.
Diving into this incredibly diverse menu, you might be a little surprised to learn just how common goat's milk is. It's actually the second most consumed animal milk globally, heavily favored across the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and sub-Saharan Africa. Thanks to its smaller fat globules, it's way easier to digest for folks who struggle with cow's milk. And then, on the flip side, we have sheep's milk. With roughly double the fat of cow's milk, it's honestly far too rich to just drink fresh by the glass. But that exact richness makes it the absolute perfect ingredient for the world's most famous, dense cheeses. Think Roquefort, Manchego, and traditional feta. But what about environments where a cow just wouldn't last a day? In the incredibly arid regions of the Arabian Peninsula, North Africa, and Central Asia, pastoralist cultures rely entirely on camel's milk. It boasts higher vitamin C and lower lactose than cow's milk, and amazingly, it can survive without refrigeration in sweltering heat where cow's milk would spoil in a matter of hours. Talk about a perfect environmental adaptation. Now let's travel way up to the freezing Tibetan Plateau. Cows definitely cannot survive that extreme altitude and cold, but yaks absolutely thrive there. Yak milk is incredibly dense, boasting over 7% fat. This extreme caloric density keeps the calves warm, sure, but for the human populations living there, it provides vital energy. In fact, it's famously churned into yak butter to make their traditional Tibetan butter tea.
Out on the Central Asian steppes, nomads have actually spent thousands of years milking horses. Mare's milk is notably high in lactose, which makes it an absolute dream for fermentation. Bacteria and yeasts go to work converting that lactose into lactic acid and a tiny bit of alcohol, which creates a slightly fizzy, tangy, and easily digestible staple beverage known as kumis.
And if we push even further north into the brutal, harsh subarctic conditions of Scandinavia and Siberia, we find indigenous peoples consuming reindeer milk. Remember how we talked about environmental adaptation with a seal? Well, reindeer milk sits at roughly 22% fat. To put that into perspective, drinking reindeer milk is essentially like drinking heavy cream straight from the carton. It provides massive, rapid energy reserves that are absolutely crucial in that climate. We've also got some incredibly specialized milks. Donkey milk, for instance, has the closest composition to human breast milk of any commonly available animal. Back in ancient Rome, it was highly prized and used as a direct substitute for human milk in wet nursing. Now contrast that delicate specialized composition with water buffalo milk. Water buffalo are actually the primary dairy animal in parts of India, literally outpacing cow production. And their incredibly rich, high-fat milk is the non-negotiable essential ingredient for traditional southern Italian mozzarella di bufala.
Which brings us to Section 3, the domestication filter. Why exactly don't we milk lions or zebras?
Seeing all these amazing milks brings up a pretty obvious question, right? If there are all these nutritionally diverse options out there, why haven't we tapped into the rest of the 5,000 mammal species? Well, the answer is what experts call the domestication filter. For an animal to become a viable dairy source, it has to pass a rigid behavioral test. It must have a docile temperament, breed happily under human management, adapt to being confined in a herd, be safe to approach, and, crucially, produce enough milk to actually justify the massive effort of keeping it. Fail even one of these criteria, you're off the farm.
This filter perfectly explains why some theoretical edible milks will literally never hit grocery store shelves. Take the lion. It produces a really rich, fatty milk that humans could technically consume. But let's be real, attempting to milk a dangerous, predatory apex feline is a spectacularly terrible agricultural strategy. Then there's the zebra. It's closely related to the horse, which we know can be milked, but zebras have specific, hardwired fear and panic responses. They have completely resisted thousands of years of human domestication attempts.
And you know, it's not even just about the danger factor. It's about basic agricultural logic. Even animals with fascinating milk fail the filter. Moose, for example, produce extraordinarily fat-rich milk, but they yield incredibly low volumes and are a total nightmare to manage at scale. And the kangaroo? The kangaroo is just wild. They produce biochemically complex milks, simultaneously secreting entirely different chemical formulas from different glands for different aged joeys. It's a biological marvel for sure, but absolutely impossible to manage as a human food supply.
So that brings us to Section 4. Why the cow won? And the answer comes down to scale, geography, and history.
So if cow's milk isn't nutritionally superior to camel, yak, donkey, or reindeer milk, and as we've just seen, it really isn't, how did it become the unquestioned global standard? The whole mystery is solved by this one staggering number, 10,000 liters. That is the annual yield of a high-producing dairy cow. When you compare that to a sheep's 200 liters or a goat's 500 liters, the volume difference is absolutely astronomical. For early civilizations settling down in temperate agricultural zones, cattle became the ultimate engine. They efficiently converted grass, which humans can't digest, into massive, unparalleled volumes of food for large, growing populations. But volume is really only half the story here. The other half is history. Because cattle were so perfectly suited to temperate European geography, they essentially became the bedrock of European agriculture. And over the last 5 centuries, driven by European colonial expansion, these specific agricultural systems and the cattle they relied on were aggressively exported around the entire globe. They were introduced to the Americas, Australia, and parts of Asia and Africa, actively displacing or just overpowering local, deeply rooted dairy traditions along the way.
Which ultimately brings us to this profound realization. The milk in your coffee is an accident of history wearing the disguise of inevitability. Cow's milk didn't win because it's biologically superior. It won because of a very specific combination of domesticability, massive volume, geographic luck, and the historical timing of global expansion. What we consider completely, boringly normal is actually just a fascinating historical coincidence, and it really leaves you wondering, the next time you open your fridge, what other everyday absolute defaults in our lives are just accidents of history, just waiting to be investigated?